Something happened in Las Vegas last week that I genuinely don't think got enough attention. Not a trade, not an injury, not some locker room blowup. It was quieter than that, but in a lot of ways, it said more about what's actually going on with this Raiders quarterback situation than anything else we've heard all offseason. Clint Kubiak basically walked up to the entire football media world and said, "You've got this wrong." Not aggressively, not defensively, but clearly. And when a head coach does that, I think you have to stop and actually listen, because most coaches don't do that unless they mean it. So let me tell you what I actually think is happening inside that building, and why I believe the story everyone's been telling about Kirk Cousins versus Fernando Mendoza is not just incomplete, it's almost entirely the wrong story. Let's start with where Mendoza actually stands right now, because I think there's a major disconnect between the version that's been circulating online and what's genuinely happening on that practice field. By the time mandatory minicamp wrapped, Mendoza was still taking the bulk of his reps with the third-string group. Third string, not second. Third, behind Kirk Cousins, obviously, but also behind Aidan O'Connell. Now, if you've only been following the headlines, that fact probably hits differently than you'd expect, because the headlines have been painting a very different picture. Words like explosive, phrases like blowing the coaches away, comments about leaps and bounds. And here's the thing, all of that is actually real. Those aren't invented quotes. People inside that building have genuinely said those things. But what gets left out every single time is the other half of the picture. Mendoza started at the very bottom of that depth chart. And as of minicamp, that hadn't changed yet. That's the part that keeps getting buried under the hype. And I want to push back on the instinct to treat those two facts as a contradiction, because they're not. They're measuring completely different things. Development and depth chart position are not the same metric. One of them tells you where a player is going, the other tells you where he is right now. A player can be improving at a rate that genuinely impresses everyone watching and still be third on the depth chart, because the guys in front of him haven't stumbled yet. That's not irony. That's just how football works. But I feel like a lot of the conversation around this room has been treating trajectory and current standing as if they're interchangeable, and they're absolutely not. Now, let's talk about the player who I think has been the most underserved by this entire narrative, because there's somebody getting almost completely lost in the Cousins-Mendoza noise, and it's genuinely unfair to him. Aidan O'Connell has had a really strong offseason. Not decent, not quiet, strong enough that people watching practice closely have basically said it would be a significant leap for the top overall pick to jump him without real sustained time to do it. And O'Connell himself hasn't been doing the usual quarterback diplomatic dance about all of this either. He's been refreshingly direct. The best player should play. Full stop. No softening, no political language, just a flat, honest statement of competitive philosophy. And I love that, not because it's dramatic, but because it tells you something real about the culture in that room. Nobody in there is hiding behind carefully managed answers. Cousins isn't performing some wise mentor character. O'Connell isn't quietly accepting a support role. Mendoza isn't pretending he's content to wait forever. All three of them want the job, and that's exactly what you want in a room that's supposed to produce legitimate competition rather than just the appearance of it. But here's what Kubiak's pushback really means to me, and why I think it matters more than people gave it credit for. When a head coach goes out of his way to actively shut down a specific media narrative, there are typically two explanations. Either the room is more fragile than it looks and he's in damage control mode, or the room is in genuinely good shape and the narrative itself is the problem. Based on everything else I've seen and heard come out of that facility, I'm firmly in the second camp. Because Kubiak didn't just say there's no controversy, he reframed the entire premise of what's happening there. His message was that all three quarterbacks, Cousins, O'Connell, and Mendoza, are being asked to get themselves ready to play and win games at a high level. That's the assignment for all of them. Not Cousins holding down the fort while Mendoza waits. Not a two-man race with O'Connell as a spectator. All three of them competing, all three of them pushing each other, with the understanding that a better quarterback room makes the whole team better. That's not crisis management language. That's the language of an organization that built something they believe in and doesn't want an outside story dismantling it before the season even starts. Let me tell you about something that I genuinely think gets overlooked in almost every version of this conversation. The advantage Mendoza has right now, hiding in plain sight. Mike McCoy, the assistant head coach, a guy who's been around every possible version of quarterback room dynamics over a long career, made a point of highlighting it explicitly. Mendoza and O'Connell get to watch two veterans operate at a professional level every single day, not in a meeting room twice a week, not in film sessions on a Wednesday afternoon, on the practice field, in real time, every single day. McCoy didn't throw that out as a small footnote. He called it fortune. And I think that framing is deliberate and accurate because most rookie quarterbacks don't get that kind of daily immersion in professional habits. They get a playbook and scattered mentorship and maybe some hallway conversations with a veteran who's already mentally checked out of his teaching role. Mendoza is getting something categorically different. He's getting a living, breathing template for how a professional quarterback operates, available to him every morning when he walks onto that field. That doesn't show up anywhere on a depth chart. It doesn't generate highlight clips, but it shows up eventually in the way a young player handles his first real pressure situation, and that is when it matters most. Now I want to address the piece of this nobody wants to say directly, but everyone keeps dancing around. Kirk Cousins is 38 years old. He's coming back from an Achilles injury, and his most recent stretch of football in Atlanta didn't look like the version of Cousins that built the reputation that earned him that contract. I'm not saying that to pile on him. I'm saying it because it's the honest context for understanding why this whole situation feels different from a typical veteran-rookie dynamic. Because if Cousins struggles even briefly once real games start, the patience everyone is currently preaching is going to erode fast. That's just the reality of how fan bases and media cycles work in the modern NFL. Losses accelerate everything. A few rough games, a couple of off performances, a fan base that's already been primed all offseason to be excited about the future, and suddenly the conversation goes from controlled development to emergency promotion overnight. It doesn't take a catastrophe, it just takes a handful of uncomfortable moments, and the noise from outside that building gets loud enough to pressure decisions that weren't supposed to happen until later. And the history here is not subtle. When you look at top 10 quarterback picks over the last decade and a half, the overwhelming pattern is that they don't wait as long as anyone plans for in June. Most of them end up starting a significant number of games in their rookie year, not because the plan always changes on purpose, but because circumstances force the timeline. Injuries happen, struggles happen, front offices feel pressure from ownership, fan bases demand to see the future they invested in. It's a pattern so consistent, it almost feels inevitable, which makes all the talk about patience and process and letting Mendoza develop behind veterans feel a little bit fragile to me. Not because the organization doesn't mean it, but because the NFL has a way of making people not mean it by November. Here's the part of the story that actually surprised me the most, though. Mendoza himself doesn't sound like a player trying to feed that urgency or ride it. Every time he's been asked about the competition, about the depth chart, about when he expects to play, the answer has been almost aggressively understated. He talks about listening, about absorbing, about trying to understand the offense before trying to execute it at full speed. Most of it, he said, is just listening right now. And look, I know that could be a coached answer. I know a lot of rookies in this situation learn to say the right things in front of cameras. But what makes Mendoza's posture feel different is that it's been completely consistent across months of interviews and practice reports and background details. A player who's performing patience for the cameras usually cracks at some point. He'll let something slip in a tone or a word choice that reveals the frustration underneath. Mendoza hasn't done that once. Not in April, not in May, not in June. And that level of sustained consistency is either exceptional message discipline or genuine self-awareness. And based on everything I've seen from him, I think it's the second one. There's something important in that restraint too. Something that doesn't get talked about enough in these quarterback development conversations. Veterans respect the distinction between confidence and entitlement. Confidence is believing you can do something. Entitlement is believing you're owed the chance to do it right now. Every signal coming out of Mendoza points toward the first thing. He carries himself like a player who knows what he's capable of and is willing to earn the moment rather than demand it. And in a room with veterans like Cousins who have seen both types come through, that distinction matters more than people realize. A rookie who walks in acting like the job is already his before he's taken a meaningful snap alienates the room before he ever gets on the field. A rookie who works like he's trying to earn something creates a very different kind of environment. It sounds simple, but it's genuinely rare. I also want to spend a second on something that happened before Mendoza was even drafted, because I think it gets to the heart of how this organization has approached his development from the very beginning. There was reportedly a conversation between Mendoza and Tom Brady around the time of the Combine. Before the draft happened, before he knew where he was going to land, before any of this quarterback room dynamic existed. And just think about what that represents, even beyond whatever was actually said in that call. A college quarterback, weeks away from one of the biggest moments of his life, already connected to the greatest quarterback in NFL history, who also happens to have an ownership stake in the franchise that would eventually select him. That's not a normal rookie experience. That's a fundamentally different kind of onboarding. And to me, it suggests that this wasn't a front office that drafted a quarterback and then started figuring out the plan. This looks like a front office that had the plan first and found the right player to fit it. That distinction matters enormously because organizations that draft first and plan later spend the whole season making reactive decisions. Organizations that plan first and draft to fit that plan tend to make patient, structural decisions even when everything around them is pushing for urgency. Every piece of what we've seen this offseason fits that second model. The immediate attention to Mendoza's under-center mechanics, the thing most identified as his biggest weakness coming out of college. The layered mentorship structure with 2 veterans instead of 1. The Brady connection before draft night even happened. None of that looks improvised. All of it looks intentional. And that brings me to the argument I haven't seen made clearly enough anywhere. What if Kirk Cousins playing well this season is actually the best possible outcome for Mendoza's development? I know that sounds counterintuitive. The easy narrative says Cousins struggling is good for Mendoza because it accelerates his timeline. But think about it differently. If Cousins plays well enough to keep the Raiders competitive, what does that actually give Mendoza? It gives him time. Not the fake kind of time where everyone's just going through the motions until the inevitable happens. Real time. Time to work through his footwork until it's instinct, rather than something he has to consciously think about. Time to absorb the offense at a level where it stops feeling like a system and starts feeling like a language he actually speaks. Time to build trust with the offensive line in practice reps, rather than live game situations before he's fully equipped to handle them. A struggling Cousins accelerates Mendoza's timeline through necessity. A productive Cousins accelerates Mendoza's readiness through patience. Both versions eventually get Mendoza onto that field, but only one of them gets him there, genuinely prepared rather than just available. The real tension I keep coming back to isn't Cousins versus Mendoza at all. It's patience versus urgency, and how long the former can hold up against everything pushing on it from the outside. The fans who want to see the future right now. The history of top picks that suggest waiting rarely survives contact with reality. A veteran quarterback whose recent tape raises legitimate questions, and a rookie who keeps doing everything right without ever once pushing for the job publicly. That's the actual story. That's the experiment that's playing out right now. I describe this situation as 3 quarterbacks operating on 3 completely separate timelines that are going to intersect at some point this season whether anyone plans for it or not. Cousins is on a proving timeline. He's 38 and post-injury, and he knows exactly what the questions are about him, and he's trying to answer them with performance. O'Connell is on an opportunity timeline. He's quietly built a real case over this offseason that honestly deserves more credit than it's received, and he's waiting for a door to open. And Mendoza is on what I'd call an inevitability timeline, not because the job is guaranteed to come to him, but because the only real variable left is how much patience the organization can sustain before outside pressure changes the math. Those timelines don't need to collide dramatically. They might just intersect naturally, the way these situations typically do, with one quarterback's difficulty creating another quarterback's opening at a moment that nobody sitting in June could have predicted. That's not a controversy. That's just what happens inside a quarterback room healthy enough to let real competition develop organically, instead of forcing it for the benefit of a narrative. What Kubiak shut down wasn't just a specific angle. He pushed back on the entire framing of what's happening in that building. And based on everything we actually know, he had every reason to. Because what's developing in Las Vegas isn't a quarterback controversy waiting to explode. It's something more interesting and more rare than that. It's a patient, structured, deliberate attempt to build a young franchise quarterback the right way, inside the right environment, with the right people around him, while managing the very real noise of an impatient world that wants answers before the questions have even fully formed yet. Whether that patience survives the full season is genuinely unknown. These things rarely go exactly as planned, but the foundation looks more solid than the outside narrative has given it credit for. And when training camp opens and the pads go on and we finally stop talking about what might happen and start watching what actually does, I think a lot of people are going to have to revisit the story they've been telling. Not because they were wrong about Mendoza's talent, but because they were wrong about what's actually being built around it.